I'm Vicki, Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and filmmaker David Abel. His 2018 documentary, Lobster War, The Fight Over the World's Richest Fishing Grounds, is screening for local audiences at the Fundy Film Festival. The film takes us inside the disputed gray zone between Canada and the U.S., where climate change and competing fishing rules have sparked a high-stakes cross-border lobster feud. Thank you so much, David, for sitting down with me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can we start off by just talking about your background as both a journalist, a filmmaker? Where can people see you work? And please do tell us where the Pulitzer Prize comes from in your career.
Sure. Well, it actually is sort of what got me into filmmaking. So I've been a journalist for many years, and I've covered all sorts of things. But the last 25 years, I've been a reporter at the Boston Globe. And in 2013, I was actually on leave from my job at the Boston Globe doing this fellowship where you get to spend a year at Harvard studying anything you want, and it's kind of like Nirvana for journalists. And I was over the preceding few years, as newspapers became more multimedia institutions, we were increasingly encouraged to experiment with video. And so I got a taste of telling stories in a visual way. And when I did this fellowship at Harvard, I was able to take this class learning the grammar of filmmaking. And for the final class project, I was making what I thought was going to be a short film about the first little person to run the Boston Marathon. This was going to be just a class project, and I spent a few months still learning how to use a camera, and I was following her as she was training and getting ready for the marathon. And then on the day of the marathon, I was up with her really early as she was getting ready, and then I took the bus to the starting line with her, and I filmed her crossing the starting line, and then went to the halfway mark and then the finish line. And I was there waiting for what I thought was going to be the triumphant ending of this short film, a class project that I was making, when all of a sudden, about 20 steps from where I was standing, the first bomb detonated by the finish line of the Boston Marathon. And at first I had no idea what happened. And then about 12 seconds later, the next bomb exploded, and I realized there was probably an attack. And then I started to realize, oh my God, I'm holding a camera. I should probably document what is happening. And I actually called in to my editors at the Boston Globe what was happening, and dictated the first story about the bombings as I was filming the aftermath. And so that work, we won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news with the staff of the Globe. Some of my colleagues did some really amazing work. Some photojournalists there took these really moving, iconic images that went all over the world. And if you've ever seen any of the footage from the aftermath of the bombings, you've probably seen the footage I shot that day. And that led to my first short film. And then I continued learning the craft of making films and continuing to make films.
Wow. So it just hit you obviously in that moment of that experience to change the focus, to pivot as fast as you could to document what you had to document.
Yeah, no, it was just this kind of instinctual response that all of a sudden there was something horrific and epic that was happening, and I felt this need to document it.
So I wonder what brought you to the gray zone, and if you can explain. I'm sure a lot of people in Southwest New Brunswick know what it is, but what brought you to that subject matter? Obviously, being in Boston, you're very close, and made you want to cover it, though.
So before I went to do this fellowship, I started covering environmental issues for the Boston Globe. And one of the biggest environmental stories is, of course, climate change. And we are seeing the impacts of climate change in our region perhaps no more so than in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy. And so I had started covering the impacts of warming waters, the waters in the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy, maybe a little less so in the Bay of Fundy, but also in the Bay of Fundy, have been warming at incredible rates, allegedly warmer than any other body of water on the planet. And it has had an impact on our fisheries. And the one fishery in the beginning of my time covering these issues that had the most salient impact was cod. And we had seen the complete collapse of the cod fishery. And actually, I had, some time before 2013, went up to Newfoundland, where we had seen years before that the collapse of the iconic fishery up there. And I went to cover that and what the impact was on folks in Newfoundland and people who used to fish and could no longer fish, because we were starting to see that happen in New England, particularly in the Gulf of Maine. And all of a sudden, the unthinkable happened, something similar to what happened in Newfoundland, which was that the federal government in 2014 declared a moratorium on commercial fishing of cod. And that led to all kinds of protests, just like happened in Newfoundland. And it was really hard on a lot of people whose lives depended on this species. And so that led to my first feature film about environmental issues. It was called Sacred Cod, and it was all about the efforts to try to save cod and the fishermen who were experiencing the impact of this closure or the ban on fishing. And while I was making that film, I learned quite a bit about what was happening to lobster as a result of climate change. And we were seeing dramatic impacts of lobster from the warming waters in the Gulf of Maine and also south. So we had seen a 95% collapse of the lobster fishery in the waters from Cape Cod to south to New York, where there used to be a thriving lobster fishery, and then it just completely collapsed because the water just became too warm to sustain the lobster population. And then we were starting to see the opposite thing happen as the waters in southern New England became a little too warm for the lobster. They started moving north. And they started to inhabit waters where there was a relatively small population because the waters were a little too cold, and that includes parts of the Bay of Fundy, and then this area around just off of down East Maine and just south of Grand Manan that has long been called the Gray Zone, and it's called the Gray Zone because both the United States and Canada have long claimed the 270 or so miles, I don't know how that translates into kilometers, square miles around Machias, this small rock, essentially. It's a puffin colony that the Canadians built a lighthouse on more than a century ago. And it is I think the last remaining contested land border between the United States and Canada. And nobody really cared about this little rock. But all of a sudden, when the waters, this gray zone around that island became flush with an exploding population of lobsters, the Canadian fishermen who long ceded those waters to the Maine fishermen decided, we're gonna fish those waters now because they're so valuable and filled with lobster. And that set off all kinds of conflict over gear and really peeved a lot of the Maine fishermen because they had long fished there alone.
I have to say too, now in the era of the 51st state talks that we've heard in this political climate, it takes on a new level now. This film came out 2018, 2025. Different landscape for these considerations. What was it like talking to both American fishers and Canadian fishers, and how did their points of view vary or conflict?
there's fishermen are very passionate and independent-minded people, no matter which side of the border they're on. And they, more than anything, are territorial, and they don't want others fishing the bottom that they have long fished. And that goes for whichever side of the border you're on. If you're a Mainer and you come on another Mainer's traps, that's a recipe for conflict. And the same thing goes for Canadian fishermen out of Grand Manan, which are the primary fishermen that come into the gray zone. But in short, you know, a lot of these guys sort of knew each other or had come to know each other and had cordial relationships, but it started to grow tense over the last decade as more and more boats entered this relatively confined area, and there are really strong currents. It's really difficult to fish there because the tides are very powerful, and people's gear was being cut and sabotaged, and that created all kinds of anger and disputes. And as you mentioned, with the whole 51st state talk, which I want to say, as an American visiting Canada, I am so sorry. Wherever the camera is, please accept my apologies on behalf of all Americans, if possible. My only hope is that the President of the United States does not see this film or learn anything about Machias Seal Island, because who knows, the Marines could end up, they were in LA, the National Guard is now patrolling the streets of Washington, D.C. Who knows if they're going to be, you know, bunking with the puffins and taking over the lighthouse.
I will be perfectly honest with you that I have that fear too. But I think what's neat about it is an American journalist, a Canadian journalist talking about this. I could tell you from the Canadian perspective, some of concerns our fishers are that the Americans are allowed to set more traps, that they wouldn't fish in the summertime. They would close off that season. There are different rules. And because of that, that's what's led to a lot of this conflict that I'm sure in your time filming must have been scary. Were there times you were fearful?
No, not really. I mean, you know, I think fishermen, lobstermen are, you know, surly, crusty characters, but they also have really big hearts. And, you know, if you rub them the wrong way, look out. But aside from that, you know, they're happy to, they love to talk, they love to share stories, and many of them welcome me into their homes. And so I'm extremely grateful that people gave me the time and that they did, and shared the stories that they did, and welcomed me onto their boats, which are, you know, in a lot of ways their second homes. But I worry, you know, this conflict continues to fester. There has been no resolution, and now, as you know, there's a tariff war waged by the United States against Canada, and we have this. I think this is a factual statement, a completely bombastic president who says things that just come to his mind, often with little forethought. It is frightening, and my hope is that this relatively, this long existing conflict doesn't boil over into something worse.
What have you noticed are differences in terms of reactions from American audiences and Canadian audiences, or are they relatively the same?
That's a really good question. I think that there's similar response to the film. I don't know if there is a big difference between both sides. I think both view. The general response. Most Canadians and most Americans have no idea about the gray zone. They have no idea about this border conflict. or this watery conflict over the gray zone, this sea that's contested. But when they learn about it, it's more, I think, of interest and curiosity than anything. But the people who fish there, the people whose lives and households and economies depend on fishing these waters, are very keenly aware of these issues. And there are all kinds of concerns on both sides of the border about different ways we regulate the lobster fishery. If you talk to folks in Maine, they say that the Canadian regulations for lobster are lax, and that they're not protecting the big lobsters that spawn, because Canadian fishermen can take them out of the water and harvest them. They are also allowed to take smaller lobsters, juvenile lobsters, whereas American or Maine fishermen can't do that. And we have a whole host of regulations in the United States pertaining to our lobster fishery, which a lot of American fishermen say should be the rules also in Canada. But the Canadian fishermen say, well, we have our own rules, and for example, they do not fish in the summer, except in the gray zone, and they have different ways of conserving the fishery, and there are constantly talks. I don't know if those will continue in the Trump era, but there had been, constantly conversations between fishing officials and fishermen on both sides of the border, trying to harmonize policies and make this, sustainable for everyone.
When you look at it from the perspective of climate change, what does it tell you? What were your biggest surprises covering? I know a lot of what I learn about the ocean, even to do with climate change, comes from the fishers in our area. They are on the water every day, and they see things the rest of us don't, even if we're looking closely at it, in an article. And I've heard that the lobster could be, in 50 years, much further north. What does that tell you as someone who looks closely at climate change as a journalist, and what did you take away from that?
So there is no doubt that this issue over the gray zone might become less of an issue over time, because as lobsters move north, there may be less concern about fishing in this one area as the Bay of Fundy and even maybe the Gulf of St. Lawrence becomes more flush with lobster, and maybe this gray zone isn't as especially valuable as it has become over the last decade, because and we're already seeing this. But you guys on your side of the border are seeing your own internal conflicts, and I wrote about this for the Boston Globe a couple of years ago about the conflict between the native Canadian fishermen who don't, by law, have to abide by the same rules as most other commercial fishermen in Canada, particularly in Nova Scotia, and that has led to a whole other kind of lobster war on the southwest coast of Nova Scotia, where there have been boats cut free and lobster pounds burned down and boats confiscated by the Canadian Coast Guard, if that's the proper name for it. And so, and this will happen as fisheries change. We have all kinds of other conflicts on the east coast of the United States as black sea bass have moved from the mid-Atlantic up toward toward the New England area, and there are fights over quotas and who should be fishing this historical fishery that has been really important to mid-Atlantic fishermen, like from North Carolina up through New Jersey. And now suddenly, the lobster, the black sea bass fishery and other fisheries are moving, and it's scrambling all these traditional historical ways of fishing and also the population of these fisheries, and that can have a really devastating impact on economies that have been reliant on these fisheries for generations.
Yeah. When you set out to do this film, often when you do a big project, it can change you. It can change the way you approach the next thing you do. What were your biggest takeaways? What were you surprised that you came across? And did the story take shape in ways that you didn't expect it to?
Well, I like to talk about when you're reporting a story, when you're covering a story as a journalist, one thing sort of leads to another thing. And in the course of making this film, Lobster War, I learned a lot about the impacts of the lobster industry on one of the most critically endangered species, particularly great whale species in the world, the North Atlantic right whale. And I knew nothing about this really beforehand, but the more time I spent in this world of lobstermen and learned about these things called vertical buoy lines, the lines that go from the traps on the sea floor to the buoys on the surface, and how they can entangle these whales. There are only about 370 of them left. Fewer, I believe, than 70 reproductive females left, and without reproductive females, the population will go extinct. These lines are like minefields from Cape Cod through the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they have had a dramatic impact, harming whales, impacting their ability to reproduce, reducing the amount of food that they can take in. There have been all these things. So one of the major things that I learned and had an impact on me while I was making this film about the gray zone was the impact on this critically endangered species. And that led to me to make my next film after this, which was called Entangled.
Wow. Can I ask then what comes after Entangled as we look forward to following your career and what you take on next?
So after I made Entangled, I actually landed on another story that kind of fused Lobster War and Entangled. It was about a lobsterman and a whale. And this film was called In the Whale. And when I heard about this, because of my interest in lobstermen and whales, it was an irresistible story to cover. But it's a story about a Cape Cod lobsterman. He's actually the last remaining commercial lobster diver, as far as I know of, in New England, who on his third dive of the morning in June of 2021 was effectively swallowed by a humpback whale. He was literally Jonah style caught in the watery cavity of the whale's giant mouth. He was coming down and the whale was coming up feeding, and humpbacks have their eyes on their sides, so they don't see apparently quite well right in front of them, and he just got scooped up and he was in the mouth of the whale for, he says, between 30 and 45 seconds, but lived. He got sort of thrown out at the surface. He apparently emerged fins first, and this was a huge news story all over the world, actually. And I came to know the first mate of this lobster diver through making Entangled. And just like I was talking about how one story can lead to the next, well, it was just by sheer chance that I had known his first mate, who welcomed me to sort of meet this diver who has been being bombarded by people all over the world to tell his story. And then I wrote a story about it for the Globe. And actually, that story that was in the Globe had the best headline to ever accompany any story I had ever written in the Globe. And the headline said, "This fish story isn't hard to swallow."
Well done. Well done.
And that ended up becoming a film with the title of In the Whale.
Wow.
And my other recent film related to similar kinds of issues is all about how one coastal city decided to spend billions of dollars building an entirely new urban district at sea level, on landfill, and hard on the coast, despite having more climate scientists per capita than probably any other city on the planet. And that, of course, is my city, Boston. We decided to build this new urban district called the Seaport, and spent probably $20+ billion building this entirely new American dollars, building this entirely new urban district that is incredibly vulnerable to rising seas. And so I made a film. This area was being christened as the Innovation District. The city and the state spent a lot of money through tax incentives, bringing Fortune 500 companies to set up their headquarters, including like GE and PricewaterhouseCoopers and other major companies set up their headquarters in this place. And the title of the film is Inundation District.
Well, I have so enjoyed having you today. I hope anytime you are back in this part of the world, and I have a feeling you will be, given your particular areas of interest, please come back, sit down, and tell us what you're working on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Vicki. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
My guest today has been David Abel, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and filmmaker behind Lobster War. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.